Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Stay at Home. It's a political education series by Jacobin magazine. My name's Matt. I'm a contributing editor here at Jacobin. I'm filling in for Bhaskar tonight. And every week, as you guys probably know, for the past few months, we've been hosting a left-wing thinker, writer, organizer to talk about something we feel is relevant or important politically. And all of our previous videos, if you're on the page, you can see are archived here on the Jacobin YouTube page. Check them out when we're done here. One that you might be especially interested in that I'll plug selfishly is the stay-at-home talk I did on the mass politics of anti-slavery, based on an article I wrote for Catalyst that was also published online in Jacobin. It really ties in tonight with our conversation about this Republican paramilitary organization known as the Wide Awakes that helped defeat slavery politically before they defeated it on the battlefield. Our only ask tonight, right now, is that you hit like and you hit subscribe to these videos, that you share the stream with your friends and your comrades, and this is how we're growing this beast. We've already grown a lot on YouTube, and we'd like to get even bigger. Also, one more plug tomorrow. This is a really important one. Jacobin will be putting on a tribute to Michael Brooks, our great departed, still in utter shock about this, comrade, hosted by Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila. A lot of people in the Jacobin orbit will be involved in that production. I know I'll be watching it and trying not to cry. But we've got a show to do, and we've got a good show too. We're joined today by Matthew Stanley. He's a professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Albany State University. He recently wrote a piece for Jacobin titled "Lincoln's Paramilitaries: The Wide Awakes Helped Bring About a Political Revolution." He can say that in a Bernie Sanders accent, or he can just say that in his normal voice. He's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll jump into the mix, and we'll go back and forth. We may discuss the film Titanic, we may not. And then we'll open it up to audience questions. So again, hit like, hit subscribe, share the video with friends. And Matt, explain who these weird freaks with capes and lanterns were, and what the hell they had to do with the anti-slavery movement.
Okay, thanks for having me on, Matt. When we talk about the Wide Awakes, we're talking about a new form of political organization, some might say revolutionary political organization that emerged during the presidential election of 1860, that married really two of the major sort of political currents of the antebellum period, the 1840s and the 1850s, the first of which was sort of militia fever. There were sort of militias and shooting clubs and Turner societies all over the place in different ethnic and fraternal organizations in the 1840s and 1850s. And the second thing is it sort of marries this idea of a militia to the mass politics, the mass democratic politics that Matt has written about in Catalyst and elsewhere. So I think probably the best way to approach this tonight is to sort of give you a basic overview, a very general overview of what the Wide Awakes were, then sort of move the lens back a little bit and talk about the Wide Awakes in the context of the election of 1860. It's hard to understand anything about the Wide Awakes without sort of an overview of the election of 1860. So I'll try to provide a cursory overview of that. But before I get into that election, I want to sort of just give a few characteristics, things that defined this group of roughly 100,000 politically engaged partisans who went out for Abraham Lincoln in the spring or the summer and the fall of 1860 and helped turn that election into a landslide electoral victory on Lincoln's part, and made really the difference not only in traditional Republican strongholds, but particularly in Democratic strongholds where partisan competition was pretty intense. So some defining characteristics about the Wide Awakes is that, first of all, this was a relatively young group. We're talking about 75% or more of the Wide Awakes were between the ages of 15 and 40. Some of them could not vote yet. Many of them were voting in their first presidential election. There were actually more wide awakes, and the way we measure this, or historians have measured this, I haven't, is by looking at the few registers, wide awake rolls and registers that still exist. And it turns out there were more wide awakes under the age of 20 than there were over the age of 50. So this is quite a young group. It's also a non-elite group, meaning that it wasn't piloted by sort of party directors and party elites. It was something that emerged rather spontaneously, rather organically, and was comprised mostly of wage laborers and farmers, but also skilled artisans, clerks, mechanics, apprentices, and it was seen both from the inside and from the outside as a non-elite group. And in some ways, a group that was heavily, disproportionately comprised of workers. As Matt alluded to, it was also a pseudo-military organization. If we could get maybe Cale the picture of the 12 Wide Awakes, the original Hartford 12. Yeah, these are the original sort of founding company of the Wide Awakes, which were founded in Hartford, Connecticut in March 1860. And as you can see, it looks like a military organization. They're not carrying guns. They're carrying lanterns filled with oil. These would be, of course, used for marching at night, and these sort of enameled jet black capes that would, not only protect them from the elements, but also prevent the hot oil from dripping onto their bodies. And they would also wear, in sort of the fashion of the day, the French military kepi, which was, of course, popularized later on during the war. And those, it would be a lot more colorful. Obviously, would prefer a colorized image. Those kepis would be like red, white, and blue, and a little more vibrant. And here's like sort of a close up. And this is a wide awake from Iowa, as you can see, quite young, 20, maybe late teens, early 20s. And again, sort of, looks like the part of the flag is colorized. It's probably says Lincoln and Hamlin and maybe the local congressional race. Okay, these wide awakes also possessed, in some cases, sort of a sense of historical mission, and that's something I touch on in the piece too, is that they saw themselves like so many different political movements and workers' movements, even though this is not a workers' movement, like many political movements of the mid and late 19th century. They saw themselves as carrying on sort of the traditions of the American and even the French revolutions. So they saw themselves as sort of political revolutionaries. And they provided intentionally, and it was something that happened unintentionally as well, an identity to a party, a political party. Remember, the Republican Party in 1860 is only 6 years old. It's a relatively new political party, sort of born out of the ashes of the Whigs. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. But it provided identity and stability to a new political party. And most importantly, the Wide Awakes were able to organize tens of thousands, at least, at minimum, tens of thousands of new and first-time voters into the Republican camp in 1860. Lincoln in 1860, though he only won 40% of the total vote in a four-way race, he still won 500,000 more votes than John C. Fremont had won in 1856 as the Republican candidate. So we're talking about large numbers of voters going over to the Republican fold. Many of them, as Bill Knapp and other historians have talked about, were not only immigrants, German immigrants particularly, immigrant voters, as well as former know-nothings who had voted for Millard Fillmore in 1856. But a large numbers of them were actually first-time voters. So the idea of sort of as we call it today, and actually a term that was used by some Republicans at the time, political revolution, meaning sort of expanding the electorate downward. So this was a concept that they were consciously cultivating. And the final point I want to make about the Wide Awakes before zooming the lens back and talking about the 1860 election is that they provided sort of a powerful cultural agitation that was directed at Southern Democrats and at planners in particularly. So a lot of the secessionists of the fall of 1860, the winter of 1860, the secession winter, and into the spring, they cite Wide Awakes as a threat, as something that they see as possibly a permanent fixture in the American political landscape, and one of the reasons that they, cite in wanting to leave the Union. And so they call the wide awakes things like the wide awake barbarians, the wide awake Praetorians, and it sort of feeds this secessionist paranoia. Okay, so these are sort of the basic hallmarks of the wide awakes as I see them. But to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about the election of 1860, which is probably got to be maybe the most studied presidential election ever. Despite that, there hasn't been a lot written on the wide awakes. So when I went into this piece, I knew sort of one article that existed that was a really good one by John Greenspan that came out in the American Historical Review in 2008 or 2009. And I thought, well, I'll start there and then go forward. It turns out that the Greenspan article is kind of it. There's not much below the iceberg, to use a Titanic reference. Maybe more on that later. So the election of 1860, critical election, arguably the most important in American history. And it is in many ways, it sets in motion the secession crisis. It sets in motion the Civil War, but it's also the culmination of over a decade and a half of conflict, or over a decade anyhow of conflict in the political arena. The coming out of the political crisis of the 1850s, the Kansas Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid, all of this sort of feeds into the politics of 1860. The second party system had been destroyed. So before the Republicans and the Democrats, of course, the two major parties were the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs begin to dissolve in 1854 in response to the Kansas Nebraska Act. The Republican Party is formed in the summer of 1854. Out of the ashes of the Whig Party and the remnants of the old Liberty and Free Soil parties. The new Republican Party has this sort of ideology, this ethos of free labor that Matt has written about, and Eric Foner and others. This ethos is tied to an anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. So these ideas of land reform, and land reserves in the West being tied to the restriction of slavery, the emancipation of slaves, and the idea of a slave power conspiracy, that there is a cabal, a cadre, a dangerous oligarchy of slaveholders that are stifling sort of the potential and the possibilities and the upward mobility of common small landholders, free soil adherents. So the election of 1856, which is the first presidential election that sees a Republican candidate, a guy named John C. Fremont, who does really well, considering his party is only 2 years old. And in a three-way race, he wins about a third of the vote. And so, actually, I didn't have a map of 1856, but yeah, here's the Republican counties that Fremont wins in 1856. And as you can see, this is a thoroughly Yankee party. Fremont fares very well in the popular vote and the Electoral College, and it's obvious that sort of the weak link for the Republicans. In other words, the states and the areas they need to win in 1860 are the sort of lower parts of the North, places like Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, which I think the Republicans win about a third of the votes in Pennsylvania and about 40% in Indiana and Illinois. So these become the areas that are really the focus for a lot of Republicans in 1860. So Fremont does well. And here's the county map in 1860. And you can see if you go back and forth between 1856 and 1860, you can see the county gains that the Republicans make over a 4-year period. So if you're thinking about where the wide awakes are most effective at enlisting new voters, these counties that go from not being red or not being very red to being either slightly red or deep red are a good place to start. And the interesting thing about the wide awakes' effectiveness in mobilizing voters is that they are, they're not the mobilization isn't strongest in traditionally strong Republican areas. So Lincoln wins 75, 80% of the vote in Vermont, high numbers in Massachusetts and Maine. But those aren't where wide awake organizations are the strongest and the most active. They're actually the strongest and the most active in places that are more highly contested between the two major parties in the North, which by the election of 1860 are the Northern Democrats and the Republicans. So, okay, 1860 is an interesting race because it's one of, probably along with 1912 and 1948, one of the only real four-way races for president in American history. And to make a very long, complicated story short, the Democratic Party breaks into two after they fail to produce a nominee at their initial convention. They break over the idea of a slave code. Southern Democrats want a national guarantee of slavery in the territories. Northern Democrats tend to back Stephen Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty, of sort of just letting settlers decide, which sounds a lot easier and cleaner than it actually turns out to be in reality. And meanwhile, as the Democratic Party is splitting, and when we've seen this other times in American history, when a party splits, it normally means it's going to lose, and that's exactly what happens in 1860. And in the meantime, to try to salvage any potential to try to protect the Union, I guess there are sort of this middle group of mostly former Whigs and former Know Nothings called the Constitutional Unionist Party. The Constitutional Unionists, which are kind of the opposite in many ways in terms of age and enthusiasm of the Republican Party. It's a very old party. It's the partisan press in the 1860 election calls the Republican press calls the Constitutional Unionists the Granny Party. So it's a party of really old men and old Unionists, old line Whigs, cotton Whigs, and Know Nothings, sort of the nativist, xenophobic party that peaked in the mid 1850s. And their sort of whole thing in 1860 is to just preserve the Constitution as it is and the Union as it is. And they win some votes in Tennessee, and actually they win Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. They nearly win Maryland. Okay, so it's within this context of the election of 1860 that the Wide Awakes emerge, and they emerge in Hartford, Connecticut, in March 1860 with 12 textile clerks and rifle makers who are basically function as bodyguards or chauffeurs for Republican gubernatorial candidate. It's a very hotly contested race for governor there in the spring of 1860. And the Republican wins by about 700 votes. It's a very highly publicized election. And one of those 12 original Wide Awakes happens to be an aspiring newspaperman, an editor, a guy named Henry Sperry. And he begins publishing articles about how the Wide Awakes were sort of responsible for tipping the balance of the election. So the Wide Awake model, the Hartford model, quickly spreads outside of Connecticut. And the Wide Awakes develop sort of their own aesthetic, as you saw from the images earlier, with the enameled cape and the torch. They have this martial paramilitary sort of look and this sort of sartorial style that they cultivate. And it's intimidating because a lot of the marching goes on at night. There are huge numbers of Wide Awakes in certain cities. By the fall of 1860, for instance, Chicago has 48 different Wide Awake clubs. I think Greenspan estimates the peak Wide Awake number at something like 100,000. Even though earlier historians, Emerson Fite, who did a study of the election of 1860 back in about 1910, estimated the Wide Awake numbers at about 400,000, which is almost certainly too high, but it gives you some idea of just how freaked out the Republican opponents were about these guys marching in the middle of the night, singing songs under torchlight. They also used they were very media savvy. They were young. So not only are we talking partisan newspapers, we're talking about pamphleteering, as well as songbooks. So they would have certain tunes that they would publish in sort of these cheap, mass disseminated songbooks that people would know. And a lot of these, like so many campaign songs and political songs in the 19th century, were kind of repurposed tunes and repurposed lyrics. So nothing new, but they made good, effective use of this media. They had nicknames for different clubs, so they'd have like the Rail Splitters or the Lincoln Guards or the Lincoln Rangers. And it didn't take long for both the Republican press and their opponents in the press to sort of recognize the classed nature of these wide awakes. So they would call them things like the young working men or the young laboring men. So they combined the sort of the youth element with this sort of class element. And they consciously tried to engage not only young voters, but also workers, or what would have been called at the time, mechanics, clerks, wage workers, small farmers. Again, this is not really an organization that's driven by elites, even though some elites are responding to it. They're thinking about how they can use this, sort of grassroots political mobilization. Some elites do join, some, out of a sense of curiosity as much as anything else. And sometimes, despite the obvious paramilitary martial look and sort of culture of the wide awakes, they're most of it is metaphorical. They're not really out fighting battles every night, though there are skirmishes. There is bloodshed between the wide awakes and supporters of the Northern Democrats or the Southern Democrats or even the constitutional Unionists who copy the wide awake model, and so they have. For instance, the Stephen Douglas supporters, they form clubs called the chloroformers. So they're going to chloroform and anesthetize the wide awakes, who are called the wide awakes because, as I think we saw in the image, in the introductory image, is sort of this eye, this wide awake, all-seeing, ever vigilant eye. So there are skirmishes, particularly in Democratic strongholds, particularly in the lower north. And by October 1860, John Greenspan, whose article is longer and more thorough than mine, and I would encourage anyone who's more interested in the wide awakes to go check it out. It's again, John Greenspan in the American Historical Review, came out about 2009. He estimates there were 100,000 wide awakes by October 1860, which would be well over 1 million, adjusted for today's population. At various marches for Lincoln in October 1860, for instance, there are over 10,000 marchers at one march in Chicago. That's not including spectators. That's just estimated number of wide awakes. There are 20,000 at a march in Lower Manhattan. Actually, can we get the wide awake march picture up again? I think this is the march in Lower Manhattan from the October 1860 march, and it's an engraving from one of the illustrated newspapers. You can see the Tribune and Times buildings kind of in the background. Matt and Cale, you're New Yorkers. I think this is Printing House Square, or what is it today would be Park Row. So you can just, this can get an idea of just the size of some of these crowds. There's another one in Detroit in October 1860 that has about 5,000 marchers, which would constitute about 10% of the city's total population in October 1860. And even after Lincoln wins the election, and Lincoln wins, of course, plurality of the vote. He wins a clear electoral college majority, even though he doesn't appear on the ballot in 10 different states. And I think the only county he wins in any slave state is St. Louis. The wide awakes don't just pack up and go home. A lot of them are the first units sort of mustered into these volunteer regiments that become the beginnings of the Union Army. So, for instance, the Camp Jackson affair in St. Louis, in which in May 1861, a Union regiment, a newly mustered Union regiment, comprised almost entirely of German immigrants and armed wide awakes. They subdue a sort of very motley makeshift secessionist militia in Camp Jackson just outside of St. Louis. So there's this fear during the secession winter among Southerners, Southern Democrats that the wide awakes will become a permanent fixture. And that, in part, is part of the idea. A lot of wide awakes are talking about a continuous mobilization. So this is both a short-term and a long-term strategy, the idea of permanently turning out new voters. And this is part of the larger strategy that Matt talks about, for instance, in his Catalyst piece, which is that, the Republican strategy of seizing power through electoral means. So not just the presidential election, but, patronage, the courts, filling up even military appointments. And part of this system involves wide awakes talking about continuously mobilizing new voters. So we're talking basically what we would call today movement politics. A 50-state strategy, never disengaging, and not just sort of, building this big, electoral machine, a la Obama in 2008, and then just sort of falling back and saying, well, we're going to do insider politics now. So this is sort of an early example of mass democratic movement politics. And what happens to these wide awakes when the war begins is that huge numbers of them, stunning numbers of them, enlist in the Union Army. So it's estimated that about 50%, maybe slightly under, higher in certain areas than others, of all eligible men of military age enlist in the Union Army at some point in the war, or either drafted or enlist. So about 50%. Among wide awake clubs, that number is over 80%. So we're talking about a huge number, just a terrific amount of mobilization. Okay, so what happens to sort of the legacy of the wide awakes after the war? Well, there isn't a whole lot. They don't have their own standalone academic treatment. John Greenspan's, 10 or 15 page articles about the most comprehensive thing you're going to get. There are memoirs by former wide awakes written after the war that are very colored by the war experience, and sometimes they sort of gloss over the wide awake details, or they just mention it in passing. A lot of the wide awake stuff tended to be written out by sort of the great man histories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because we're basically talking about histories of working people in most cases. And we're talking about social history. And other than just sort of this weird feature, this sort of almost this sort of blip in the political history of the 1850s and 60s, the wide awakes don't get a lot of standalone treatment, even by people, in the memoirs and in the histories who had belonged to the wide awakes. They have been addressed by historians of the antebellum period, often as sort of these curiosities. For instance, some historians of antebellum political culture have talked about them and sort of lumped them in with sort of the drunken mobs and the sort of drunken democratic mobs of the Jacksonian era. But they're really different than that, because they are these sort of paramilitary units tied to partisan politics in a way that really hadn't existed before. And they've been sort of ignored by several generations of scholars. You really have to go back before Greenspan. You kind of have to go back to the 1970s. David Potter's classic, The Impending Crisis, has 2 or 3 really good paragraphs on the wide awakes. But before that, I didn't really find much. You had to go back to sort of Alan Nevins and some of the mid-century sort of nationalist inclined Civil War history, some of the popular Civil War histories, to find much about the wide awakes. So even in some of the obvious places, for instance, Eric Foner's terrific book on Free Soil, I think he mentions the wide awakes maybe in a footnote. I might be wrong about that. And Matt has probably read that book, probably worn out the cover reading it so much, but so he can maybe correct me if I'm wrong about that. But that's kind of sort of where things stand with the wide awake legacy. And what I'd like to, hopefully get some questions about, and Matt and I can talk about, is why the wide awakes seem so relevant, right now, after, decades of historical and popular neglect.
Cool, Matt, that was awesome. That was the election of 1860 is such a blizzard of complexity to try to do that in like 4 minutes while you're also really focusing on this bizarrely, I think you're right, understudied phenomenon is remarkable. And I think you're right. I literally have like 4 copies of Foner's book, one for basically every location that I may possibly be in, including like the bathroom. But yeah, he doesn't write about the Wide Awakes at all, hardly. And even Nevin's glances on it. You actually have to go back to like James Ford Rhodes in almost like turn of the century, because I think actually for people who lived through the 19th century, or even only doing oral histories of this period, the Wide Awakes made a much bigger imprint than they have on our much later kind of centuries later historiography, which is striking and interesting, and I think it's worthy of more study for sure. Okay, so I have a million questions for you, both from the chat and from my own self, but I wanted to actually begin with, to follow that up, this hits a lot of the notes that you hit, but it maybe gives it even a little more flesh and maybe a little humor. In my research on this stuff, I came across this article in the Quad City Times, which is a Democratic newspaper out of Davenport, Iowa. This was written by a columnist who was kind of reporting live from the Wide Awake camp, and you kind of have to imagine this. I know this is questionable or problematic, this analogy, but we're going to be working very hard. The Wide Awakes as the kind of Bernie bros before their time. I've seen people say the Babraham bros, etc. You kind of have to read this article. This is a hostile article, Democrat, kind of attempting to sort of mock the Wide Awakes. I think you have to read it as like Bill Kristol or, Tom Friedman or like Kevin Williamson from the National Review, like going to a Bernie Sanders rally and being like, I'm among the bros of Babraham. So right. This is how this guy writes about this. This is he goes to a Wide Awake drill in Davenport. He says, in order that so he introduces it, I've penetrated the hive of wakery. And then he says, by this time they had commenced to drill. In order that I might comfortably observe operations, I lit a cigar. That, sir, was a prime cigar and cost just 5 cents. Just as I was beginning to appreciate its excellence, a Wide Awake approached and informed me that smoking was not allowed. Sir, that man was very large. He had whiskers cut in the WA style, and to complete his ferocious appearance, he had a coal scuttle on his head and a glazed carriage apron around his shoulders. I discreetly threw my cigar out the window. I thought I would watch my savage friend. With utmost urbanity, he approached a German voter italicized, who was smoking a very inferior 15-cent tobacco. Mr. Editor, I fully expected that he would request that German voter not to smoke. But, sir, the savage WA complimented him on the cover of his meerschaum. That's his pipe. Sir, I appeal to the American people to rise up in their majority and at the ballot box overthrow a party which countenances such injustice, et cetera, et cetera. He goes on and talks about how they're all trying to grow beards because to pass themselves off as voters. They're all 14. They're all going to be spanked by their mothers. You have to imagine, the jaunty kind of, Ponzi correspondent in the center of Wide Awake operations. But what I love about that is, you get the class character of this coming through, clear as a bell with his, his carriage apron, a workman's apron, and, putting a coal scuttle on his head like an idiot. These are things that like a railroad worker would have used, which is really powerful. So, I mean, if you have any more thoughts on to turn that into a question, I guess I would love to hear you expand more on, I know you're working on a project right now on, basically after the war, labor and union workers, the Civil War in the memory of American labor, which is a fascinating topic on its own right. But, if you have thoughts on the relationship between this movement and the preliminary antebellum labor movement and trade union organization, which is complicated, but is generally on the class character. I mean, you talked about farmers' sons and artisans and mechanics and so on, but it's really vivid if you read the partisan press of the era.
Yeah, that's something that again and again, both Wide Awakes and the Republican press talk about, and even Republican elites talk about. Okay, we've got this sort of this group of sort of mechanics and young workers, and how can we mold them and fashion this to our use. And it's also something that's obviously recognized as the primary source you pulled suggests. It's recognized by the opponents, and you get that you get the classism in that piece. You get the xenophobia. And yeah, I'm working on I'm actually, it's just gone into production, a book study of sort of Civil War memory among organized labor between basically the end of the Civil War and what's commonly known as the first Red Scare, which is really the second or third Red Scare, depending on how you define it. But basically between the end of the Civil War and World War I. What makes the Wide Awakes similar is that you do get a lot of these labor unions who are of this militia culture. The anarchists in Chicago in the 1880s have shooting clubs. They do these marches. They have a lot of them are in several different languages, but so were the Wide Awakes. I mean, there were a lot of German Wide Awakes. Of course, what makes the Wide Awakes have this obvious class character is it's a working class character. It's not obviously a socialist movement, but you do see these through lines between the original 48ers that came over in the late 1840s, early 1850s. These sort of liberal, some of them revolutionary nationalists, some of them socialists of different varieties. The way that militia culture impacts the Wide Awakes, the way that Wide Awake culture impacts maybe that of the Greenback Labor Party or different elements of the National Labor Union. That genealogy is obviously there. There are major distinctions because what makes the Wide Awakes unique is that they're connected to a particular party and to a particular campaign.
Right. And it's funny, again, I'm just thinking historiographically, not to alienate those of you who did not do your, PhDs in Civil War era US history, but the raucousness and yes, the class character of that campaign. If you read James Ford Rhodes, who wrote an early Civil War, era historian from the late 19th century, or if you read, Alan Nevins, if you read Albert Beveridge, a lot of Republican senator who wrote big histories of Lincoln. If you read basically any history of pre-antebellum politics before the 1960s, the kind of the raw populism of the Republican campaign, the sloppiness, the kind of aggressiveness, the kind of the way it scared the respectable classes in so many ways is all over the page. For whatever reason, the generation of historians, starting, in a sense after the Second World War, I think, were much less interested in that element of this entire movement. Now, Jim McPherson did have that great chapter called Greasy Mechanics, for A. Lincoln, et cetera. Yeah. It's not that they're not aware of it. I think Foner's aware of it, but it hasn't been a point of emphasis in the scholarship, which is interesting.
Even in Battle Cry of Freedom, which is what, 600 or 700 pages, I think there's one sentence on the Wide Awakes. But the class element is there.
Okay, I want to get to the questions from YouTube, but I have one or two more myself because I'm super thirsty about this. I know. So Matt's actually you've written a prize-winning book on the Civil War in the Lower West, essentially. From Ohio to Missouri. You're very interested in the regional and geographic character of all these, of all the politics in this period. I just kind of want to ask you about city and country, because the stronghold of the Republican Party in this period, which is very different from the contemporary political moment. The stronghold of the left in this moment was not the city, right? It was market towns and small villages and rural places, agricultural, and yet. In a lot of ways, the Wide Awakes, and that's borne out in voting rolls, that's borne out in all the press conversation where, every New York Republican paper is like, this city is a stronghold of, the money, power, mercantile property that wants to crush us out. Even Boston was much less wide awake than Worcester, et cetera. Yeah. But yet Wide Awakes do have a certain urban character, which is interesting because, these marches in New York, you have 20,000 people in Manhattan, you have 10% of the population of Detroit. There is a kind of urbanness about them. Is that striking to you? I mean, it's striking. I mean, maybe cities are naturally where, things congregate, but Republicans did a lot of rallies in small hamlets too. Whereas I have the sense that Wide Awakes are almost more intense than in urban places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly the big urban marches got the press, right? I mean, they got the publicity. But Greenspan and others have talked about, the popularity of wide awakes in certain small market towns or small market cities, market towns, but especially places with a lot of partisan conflict, places that tended to go back and forth between either Whig and Democrat or Republican and Democrat or Know Nothing and Democrat, but also, not surprisingly, college campuses, college towns. Anywhere where you find large congregations of young people engaged with ideas or politics. I don't know enough about it to answer that question in any better sense. But yeah, it is striking because it's it seems that the hotbed of wide awakes aren't necessarily, there doesn't necessarily overlap with the most obvious Republican strongholds, and you see that. Like I said earlier, you don't get a lot of wide awake activity in Vermont. Vermont goes 75% for Lincoln, and probably the reason you don't get a lot of wide awake activity vis-a-vis, maybe Pennsylvania or Indiana, is that there wasn't as much competition.
Yeah, it seems like that's the key element. I guess I would agree that it's about competition. It's about confrontation. It's about kind of showing in force, sort of in a way that is familiar in our moment in some ways. Massing in the streets to kind of confront an opposing power, and that's why you had more wide awakes in New York. It is the largest city, but also people came from all over New England and the Mid Atlantic to show up to be in New York, to kind of show off that even though New York was a heavily Democratic city, was a city dominated by the slavocracy, by the cotton trade. But okay, but we should move on to some of these other questions. Last thing that I want to ask, youth. We hear a lot about generational politics now, and again, we shouldn't make facile comparisons as historians, but this is Jacobin stay at home, so I think this is a safe space for this stuff. Bernie Sanders, right? He won. I looked at the numbers in 20th century politics. Even Obama, who was a huge youth favorite in the Democratic primary, it's not comparable to what Bernie has done. Obama and Hillary Clinton basically split the under 30 vote in California in 2008. The youth Obama thing happened in the general election. Bernie winning voters under 30 by shocking, outrageous percentages both times he ran is really unprecedented, except in some ways maybe for this crazy youth politics of this Republican moment. You said more under 20 than under 50 in the wide awake organizations. The Tribune, I was just going back and reading this, they said, as in the Revolution, there were no young Tories, so this day 3/4 of the young Americans, wherever our cause has a fair hearing, are Republicans. Historians have backed this up. Bill Gannap, who's not a Republican propagandist like I am and maybe you are, also admits that basically every young person, something like 3/4, voted Republican. What do you make of this? And is this of interest to us today in thinking about the power of the revolutionary power of a youth-driven politics?
Yeah, I mean, I typically don't put a lot of stock in sort of generational theses, these sort of broad generational theses, as it pertains to history. But there is something obviously to this, and Greenspan, for one, puts a lot of, I think he has a lot of faith in this sort of generational anxiety thesis, is what I would think he calls it, and he basically argues that this is a generation of soon-to-be voters and young first-time voters that are disillusioned with the compromise politics of an earlier generation of the 1850s. They're disillusioned with, Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas and this sort of squishy, dough-faced middle that just keeps messing things up. So that their sort of unabashed partisanship comes not only from, being youthful and optimistic or whatever, or having less to lose, I guess you could say. But it comes from like a general understanding that the politics of the previous generation have been, really messed up. They haven't produced the results we've wanted. So you could draw maybe some parallels between, the dough faces of the 1840s and the 1850s, the Whig Party in particular, and maybe our, neoliberal consensus over the last 3 or 4 decades. I don't know how strong you want to draw those parallels, but yeah, there does seem
very to be strong.
Yeah. Henry Clay was Bill Clinton.
Boom.
That's
Boom.
Yeah. That's the new book.
And answered. Okay. Yeah. Let's get to some of these questions because people are asking good, making interesting points. Okay. So we've talked both in your talk and in your article, which I really recommend everybody read. You talk at length about the kind of the class and labor character of this movement and the resentment of the slave power fundamentally as a kind of class politics. This is an argument I've made, not originally, but it's an argument that I believe in. What about anti-slavery character of this particular strand of the movement, of the Republican Party? To what extent do you see anti-slavery and the specific politics of slavery shaping wide awake politics in this moment?
Well, one way to sort of tease this out is to look at wide awake sort of cultural politics, not only the songs and what, not obviously what they wrote in newspaper accounts, but also so they're sort of cultural politics. And, I'm interested in cultural politics because I do collective memory and things of that nature. But in looking at, for instance, wide awake songs, wide awake placards, the kinds of signs they carried, Emerson Fite's 1860 a book on the 1860 election, which is 110 years old, has a really interesting page or two where he just sort of lists all of the different signage that wide awakes carried, and they tend to fall in a couple of different categories. One, internal improvements. So they say things like improve our harbors, which is not a terribly exciting slogan. Land reform, obviously, so things like the Homestead Act. There was actually one, I'm trying to think of it because it's a hell of a thing to put on a placard. It said, the United States is rich enough to give all of us a farm.
The richest country in the history of the world. Yeah. Yeah.
Internal improvements, land reform, democratic corruption falls in there a little bit. I think, it's not the extent that Michael Holt argues in his new book on the election of 1860. He sort of argues that was the thrust of the Republican campaign. You don't see that in the wide awake culture. It's probably about the fourth most important thing. But yeah, right there with land reform is, and probably ahead of it, is the idea of the slave power, which is inseparable, obviously, from homesteads and from land reform too, because you can't have a world of democratic, upwardly mobile small producers in a society where slavery exists, right? So there is this, the slave power conspiracy stuff, as you know, goes back to, maybe as early as the 1820s, but it's something that obviously the Republican Party centers beginning in 1854, and the wide awakes just take off with it. You can see it all over wide awake culture.
Yeah, and my 2 cents on this, my 16,000 words on this, are in Catalyst. But my view is that opposition to the slave power in really meaningful ways was opposition to slavery itself, and was understood as such by the vast majority who participated in this movement, despite the disclaimers about, we will know, the programmatic disclaimers that we will not. The Republican Party pledged not to, unconstitutionally outlaw slavery through congressional fiat in places where it existed. The moral and the material and the organizational impetus of the party was all geared around what its opponents called the slavery agitation. And agitating against slave power meant, yes, agitating against the slaveocracy as a class, but also agitating against the nature of slave labor as degrading to all labor, as fundamentally illegitimate, immoral, and in many cases, there was overlap with the religiously infused language of slavery as a sin. So not all wide awakes for sure, or radical Republicans were moral-based abolitionists, but that does not mean that they didn't share a fierce opposition to slavery.
Well, even the moderates are talking in the kind of language you describe. Yeah, like I said, I wrote a book on the lower Midwest, so I've studied a lot of the really conservative Republicans, and a lot of them speak a very different language than that. But as I think you're right, the thrust of the party is a coalition behind a progressive measure, that the material element is there. And it's inseparable, from, when you talk about land reform, the slave power, the degrading free labor. It's all part of the same, equation.
And there's no question, just also to address some of the things in the comments, important questions. There's no question, as you write in your article, that some segments of this, in effect, majoritarian coalition in the North, the Republicans won about 55% of the vote in the North, that this coalition included unapologetically racist elements, and those elements were also visible in the Wide Awake movement. At the same time, there were Black Wide Awakes. There were Black Wide Awakes in Boston, in Portland, Maine, in other places. It would probably be too much to call this a multiracial working class movement, like the DSA would get on board. That's not right. But to say that this movement had little to do with slavery or was indifferent to slavery, I think greatly mistakes the nature of the political moment.
No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's a winning coalition that won a national election. You're going to have disparate elements. You're going to have all kinds of different elements, depending on state and region and congressional district and everything else. And of course you can't. I mean, there are through lines. There are, I think, contemporary implications in the Wide Awake movement, particularly their theory of political change, about the best way to forward what we would call today, we think of as socialist and leftist ideas, being through a mass expansion of the electorate downward. So there are definitely contemporary implications, but it's not fair to have the Wide Awake coalition in 1860 couldn't have looked like an ideal political coalition today, for obvious reasons.
I mean, this is the pluses and the minuses of it. I mean, the truth is that in some ways, even to a much greater extent, even, I hate to say this, than the Sanders movement, I mean, this was a really mass militant organization. If you're talking about 10% of the Detroit population, that's not Antifa. That's not people who are, dedicated to street politics for street politics' sake, to making symbolic stands. There was symbolism, but the symbolism involved numbers. The obsessive, if you read the Republican press, they're obsessed with numbers, that they're bringing 10,000, 20,000, and not just into spectators, but actual marching, uniformed, members of this group. This is genuine mass politics in a way that is actually almost distinct from, I think, anything in the contemporary scene. Okay, YouTube questions, though. I don't want to lose these. We're running low on time. Organizational question on this, especially as you say, I like your phrase, downward, expand the electorate downward, or bring in new voters. Do you know anything about, the organizational politics of Wide Awakes? Did they, how was there an effort to reach out to new voters? I've read stuff in the press where they're like, well done, Wide Awakes, your next duty is to go to the ballot box. It's like, there is this sense that, like, some, even from older Republican, officials, that, okay, it's great, these people want to march, will they actually vote? The eternal question with youth voters. Is there something that Wide Awakes did to address that?
Well, they did. I mean, part of what they did were registration drives. I don't know much about the process or the specifics of those drives, but they were obviously effective. The numbers bear that out. And as far as like the day-to-day organization goes, and I touch on this a little bit in the piece, but I didn't mention it in my lecture. They had. I mean, it looked very much like a military unit. I mean, so you had commanders and commandants, but they wouldn't be. There was still a non-elite character to them. So, like, for instance, the commandant of the Springfield, Illinois Wide Awakes. The leader of the largest club in the city was like a tenor or some other wage worker. It was something along those lines. But so yeah, it also fit in with sort of the martial symbolism and the language that you see in other parts of the wide awake culture. So they had a constitution, they had like bylaws. It was it wasn't just a bunch of rowdies getting together on a Friday night. It was a rather organized affair with explicit purposes. Again, there were registration drives. I don't know exactly how they operated, but the numbers suggest that they were quite effective.
As I pour a little Austrian rosé in honor of the Turner Vine and the German Americans who died to kill slavery in the United States. Okay, we have to ask about you touched on this in the lecture, but I want to get back to this second to last question. What happened to the wide awakes after the war? You talk about, the enlistments were high. I mean, mostly they joined the Union Army, and that's what happened. But do you have any more thoughts about why this organization was such a meteor, and then it just vanished? It was in some ways the comet of 1860 that sailed across the sky, unlike, as you agree, the Jacksonian kind of raucousness before, and mass politics stayed very much militant through the Reconstruction era, obviously, right. but the wide awakes didn't. Do you have any thoughts about why it dissipated, or what happened to those impulses?
Well, I mean, obviously they got filtered into Union regiments during the war. I don't know if there was any attempt to sort of engage, wide awakeism in 1864. I would love to know what happened to like large groups of wide awakes during and after the war and sort of trace that course. One of my former mentors, Mark Laus, if you're out there listening, this sounds like a project you should do. Mark is particularly good at taking sort of working class and social histories and tracing individuals and movements through different time periods. But the short answer is
the god Mark Laus. Okay. Anyway, keep going.
I have no idea. I mean, they joined the Union Army at incredibly high rates. I'd say a lot of the political and sort of martial spirit was sort of channeled through the Union Army. I don't know what happened in 1864 or 1868.
Maybe the truth is, I mean, this is something that I think, to be honest, we can't answer this question because I don't think people have looked at it, and somebody's got to look at it. Some brave future historian here on looking at this YouTube video, go write your dissertation on the longitudinal study of the wide awakes. That would be dope.
We need a monograph.
Should DSA set up its own Lincoln Guards and rail splitters and Rangers? I kind of feel like no, because the truth is this stuff sprang almost organically to editorialize from the existing kind of mass political and martial culture of this moment. And it can't be replicated in that way without it seeming sort of weird and subcultural. But it's too bad that we don't have a mass culture that involves just like marching like badasses.
Oh, plus I really want to wear a cape. It's a creature of that particular moment, I think. I don't know what that would look like in today's terms, but yeah, as you said, it's quite a different thing than sort of the street politics that we see, whether of Occupy or I mean, there are some parallels maybe with Black Lives Matter, certainly parallels with the Bernie Bros. But it's its own thing because it was in its own historical moment.
Yeah, then the martial, the sort of emphasis on organization is something that doesn't spring organically from our protest culture right now.
No.
Okay, last question. I know this is premium material for subscribers to the Matt Stanley Patreon, so you can only give us a teaser. But Matt and I have had this conversation for many years, going back to the last decade, and I want to hear a teaser for those who are going to subscribe to your premium channel. Why is Titanic? He has convinced me on this. Why is the film Titanic the greatest working class movie ever made?
Well, I think that the three protagonists, you have Jack Dawson, Tommy, whose last name I don't know, lost to history like so many common folk, and Fabrizio. It's a shame that we don't get a sequel or a prequel of some sort. So Leonardo DiCaprio, if you're listening, James Cameron, We're waiting for the prequel that deals with sort of the origin story of the working class characters in Titanic.
With these hands.
Exactly.
What's that line again? Refresh me. That's all I remember. I remember you at a bar being like,
the Titanic was built by Irishmen with big Irish hands. So it's, Tommy is talking, they're talking about the White Star Line, who owns the Titanic. And he's saying, no, who built it were actual workers, on docks in Belfast. So, many good, Marxian lines and analogies in the film.
Yeah,
explore it for yourself. This you don't get any more for free than that.
Please do. Matt, thank you so much for this. We're at the hour. This is complicated history that in some ways is I mean, we are. It's sort of bizarre. I don't want to say that we're at the forefront of historiography because historiography doesn't give a shit about this and hasn't for 50 years. But we're doing some stuff that I think both historians and political activists should be interested in this strange moment from 1860. Even if the Bernie moment particularly has passed, I think this kind of I guess for me, one lesson. I was on the podcast with Micah Utrecht and Megan Day, the majority. I think one way to look at the wide awakes is as what happens when you have genuine mass politics. You also get militant politics. You have a majoritarian movement that is threatening the dominant ruling class and the sort of dominant political economy of a nation. And this is inherently radicalizing. It's perceived as such by that ruling class, and it generates not just large numbers of votes. It generates real militancy. Yeah. And in some ways, it's hard to separate the militancy from the macro character. Do you have any last words?
No, I think the big takeaway, and it ties in with what you're saying, is that the thing that the wide awakes got right, the thing that activists, scholars on the left, anyone on the left, the sort of the big takeaway that we need to come away with is probably the idea of continuous mobilization, of having both a short-term, long-term strategy of permanently turning out new voters. Building those sort of mass political coalitions that you said are inherently radicalizing and part of a larger material struggle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm really excited about the fact that your book went to press. Hopefully we can catch up on books and babies and life and do more Titanic deep cuts another time soon.
Let's do it. Thanks, Matt.
All right, awesome. Peace.
Thank you.